Good morning, everybody. How are you today? I want to thank you guys for coming here. Today will be, this will be the panel on whaling. I want to give some background on the moderator and the two speakers. Sin Sarthu, she's the executive director of the Gulf Restoration Network. She'll be on monitor for today. She received her BA from the University of, say that again? Guelph. Ontario, Canada, her law degree from the University of Mississippi in 1983, and her Master's of Law in Law and Marine Affairs from the University of Washington in 1992. She wrote her thesis on the effectiveness of the future of the IWC. Dr. Will Burns will be our second speaker for today. He is the co-director of the Forum for the Climate Geoengineering Assessment, a scholarly initiative of the American University, and a scholar in residence in the School of International Service at American. He also serves as the chair of International Environmental Law Committee of the American branch of the International Law Association and the president of the Association for Environmental Studies and Sciences. He wrote his PhD in International Environmental Law from the University of Wales, Cardiff School of Law, and prior to becoming an academic, he worked as the executive director of the Pacific Center for International Studies, a think tank that focused on the implementation of international wildlife treaty regimes, including the Convention on Biological Diversity and the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, or the IWC. Our first speaker for today will be Mr. Joji Morishita. He was appointed as the Director General of National Research Institute of Far Seas Fisheries, the Fisheries Research Agency, in April 2013. He also serves as Japan's Commissioner to the International Whaling Commission, the IWC again, and Mr. Morishita was posted as a Fisheries Attaché at the Embassy of Japan in the United States from 1993 to 1996. He holds a degree from the Master of Public Policy from the Kennedy School of Government from Harvard University and a BS in Fisheries Science from Kyoto University. And at the meetings of the IWC, he has been the main spokesperson on behalf of his government. Please join me in welcoming our speakers for today.
As the moderator, I just wanted to give a little background, and then I'm going to turn it over to the speakers, because I'm not really sure how many people in this room do a lot of international law or know sort of the regime under which the International Whaling Commission came to be. As our introduction showed, it's the International Convention on the Regulation of Whaling. So it was actually formed much like our fishery management councils were to try to sustain, conserve, and manage the actual take of whales. So it was not a conservation regime in its purest sense. It was more of a management regime. A moratorium was instituted on commercial whaling in 1986 and has continued ever since. There are two exceptions to that moratorium. One is for scientific whaling. The other is for aboriginal subsistence whaling. As you can imagine, there's a lot of controversy that exists around whaling, and one of the most central issues in all of this is, I think, whether the continuing moratoria is science-based or actually based on philosophical positions on whaling itself. And I think that's a lot of what our speakers will get into, is whether this is, actually a science-based management regime or merely a philosophical difference between cultures on whether whaling should or should not exist. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Morishita.
Thank you very much, and good morning. My first challenge is to show my PowerPoint. Okay. Again, my name is Joji Morishita, and because I'm from Japan, and there was an introduction about my institution, however, probably no one knows about my institution. So maybe I should make a very short introduction of my role back in Japan, then I will go into the subject of whaling. And I'm a head of a National Research Institute of Far Seas Fisheries. This is a part of Japan's fisheries research agency. And my institute has around 140 personnel and several research vessels. And we are engaged in the research activities of like tuna fisheries of the world and groundfish fishery. Groundfish means like flatfish, pollock, and Patagonian toothfish, and also engagement in some of we call the VME, vulnerable marine living resources or vulnerable marine ecosystem like corals. and including the whales and the cetaceans. So that we provide scientific information excuse me, and data for policymakers. However, before becoming a Director General, I was a part of a government policymaking mechanism, and that's why I have been engaged involved in the International Whaling Commission. And as introduced, this is one of the most controversial international issues. And sometimes a conflict that we see is even immature. Sometimes the so-called pro-whaling camp and anti-whaling camp has independent reception every night rather than having sort of a joint reception.
Speak up a little bit.
Okay, sorry about that. And maybe I should become closer to the microphone. And when people of the opposite side meet at the meeting room, they don't look to each other sometimes. And the discussion becomes sometimes very emotional. And that's the degree of sort of emotional aspects of this particular issue. And when I explain how emotional or dysfunctional this meeting itself to people back in Japan, I'm going to say that it's much worse than our parliamentary meetings, and that makes much sense to many people. I'm not sure about the congressional meeting, but our parliamentary meetings are sometimes very bad. Anyway, I will talk about many different aspects of a controversy about whaling today. First, as introduced very briefly, is whaling issue is a scientific issue involving the assessment of abundance of whales or how sustainable whaling is possible or how the conservation of biodiversity can be done through the management of whaling. And also there is a lot of legal discussions whether commercial whaling should be allowed or not under commercial whaling moratorium. And also recently, about a year ago, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, made a judgment about research activities by Japan. I will touch upon this issue very briefly. And also, the whaling issue might be portrayed as an economic issue, whether whaling industry or whaling activities is viable or necessary or should be allowed in the current world. Also, this involves a cultural, philosophical, or emotional issue. Either eating whale is a good thing or bad thing, or could be allowed or not. And also, this is related to an ethical issue of handling of animals, animal welfare issue, or should we or should world community see the animal, particular animal, as different from the rest of the animals. And there is a word like a charismatic megafauna, and that should be protected under any circumstances. And is this a correct issue to be handled by International Whaling Commission or not? Or there may be other issues. As you can see, the whaling issue covers many different aspects. So summarizing everything in 20-30 minutes is a challenge, but let me try. These are cetaceans. And around 85 different species of cetaceans are known to exist. And whales is generally regarded a larger part of a cetacean families. And International Whaling Commission is supposed to be managing the larger whales. There are differences of opinion. However, the larger ones are main target of management or conservation by International Whaling Commission. Is a pointer? Maybe it's easier to. can you see this arrow? Yes. This is a blue whale, the largest one. And this one, the minke whale. Yeah, and Japan is trying to utilize or try to show this is abundant enough and can be utilized as a resource. We have no intention of utilizing like this one, but at the same time, some indigenous people are hunting those type of whales, like bowhead, and in the Arctic Ocean. So there are many different species of whales. Oftentimes in the general public, whales are handled like the whale. However, we have to understand that there are many different species of whales with different abundance situation and different biology. About abundance, I took out some of descriptions from International Whaling Commission's website, only to show that some of the whales are abundant enough. Of course, there are many whale species which are not abundant and needs to be conserved or protected. And this one is about humpback. Says Sankri, in most areas for which there are good data, humpback whales have shown evidence of strong recovery towards their unexploited size, which may have been between 75 and 100,000 in total, with annual increase rate of about 10% being recorded in a number of areas, including of Australia, South Africa, and South America. If my bank account increased like annually 10%, that's a huge increase. About fin whale, another big one. Fin whale populations were exploited throughout the North Atlantic, and present total abundance in the North Atlantic is over 35,000 animals, although not all areas have been surveyed. Assessment of the population status in the central North Atlantic and off-west Greenland have shown populations there to be in a healthy state. This is about minke whale. As I explained, there are several 100,000 Antarctic minke whales, and thus they are clearly not endangered. Again, this is a view expressed by International Whaling Commission or its scientific committee. However, there has been an appreciable decline in the estimated abundance between the multi-year circumpolar surveys conducted between these years. Common minke whales were taken in most part of the North Atlantic, but these stocks are in a healthy state. I will skip this one. Like I said, there are some species which needs to be conserved. One of the interesting one is this one, gray whales. It's one species, but on the west side and east side of the Pacific Ocean, the situation is very different. Like this says, there are two populations of gray whales, both of which were severely depleted by pre-20th century whaling, mainly by Yankee whalers. Thankfully, the eastern North Pacific population has now recovered to around its pre-exploitation level of some 20,000 animals. By contrast, the western North Pacific population probably numbers fewer than 130 animals, and it's critically endangered. Thus, the gray whale as a species is in no danger of extinction, but its western population is at a very low level and extremely vulnerable. So what I like to try to make out of this situation is that some species are abundant, others are not. And there are no the whale or the whale abundance situation or the whale situation. This is about one of the measures taken by International Whaling Commission. The International Whaling Commission has established a whaling sanctuary in southern hemisphere in Antarctic Ocean. And every 10 years, outside experts and scientists conduct a review of its effectiveness. And this is a result of the outside review in 2004, the scientists concluded that Southern Ocean Sanctuary and IWC Sanctuary in general are not ecologically justified, that it represents a shotgun approach to conservation, whereby a large area is protected with little apparent rationale for the boundary selection and management prescriptions within the sanctuary, and that it is more prohibitive than precautionary. These words may have not been so well understood by people outside of the International Whaling Commission. I think the general perception is the International Whaling Commission is there to protect all whales under any circumstances. However, as you can see, there are different sides of the International Whaling Commission. The famous commercial whaling moratorium was established under this language. This language might be also different from the general understanding about the meaning of a moratorium itself. The language says, notwithstanding the other provisions of paragraph 10 of a schedule of a convention, catch limits for the killing of commercial purpose of whales from all stocks for the 1986 coastal and 85-86 pelagic season and thereafter shall be zero. You have to note that this is a catch limit regulation. It doesn't say the whaling is prohibited. It only says catch limit shall be zero, beginning from these years. And that's very different from the prohibition of particular activities. This provision will be kept under review based upon the best scientific advice, and by 1990, at the latest, the Commission will undertake a comprehensive assessment of the effects of this decision on whale stocks and consider modification of this provision and the establishment of other catch limit than zero. So this is a provision which set the stage for resumption of whaling. And as you can see, it was first thought that in 1990, this provision might come into force and some whaling might come back if the stock situation is good enough. However, as you may know very well, this commercial whaling moratorium is now still in effect, and by many people, this is somehow understood as a permanent ban over whaling activities. However, as you can see, the moratorium, so-called moratorium, is a provision of a temporal cessation of whaling activities and the collection of scientific data so that some whaling activities might be allowed. When this moratorium language was adopted, there have been many different discussions. And I will show you some of the statements by those countries who supported the moratorium at the time of its adoption. And this might be also very different from the general understanding of a moratorium itself. One country said, "We recognize that other countries have a legitimate commercial interest in whaling, and if in the future it could be shown beyond a reasonable doubt that some exploitation of a stock might be safely resumed and that satisfactory methods of killing are available, the lifting of the ban might be considered. What we have in mind is a moratorium and not a permanent ban." Other countries said, in the year of adoption of this moratorium language, I would repeat that and remind you that this is a catch limit proposal, not a ban or a moratorium. First of all, let me advance that I don't consider this as a total ban, but just a temporary interruption of the activity. It is with deep regret that I note that there has been a misunderstanding on the proposal of a distinguished delegate from the Seychelles. it is not the proposal for a total ban for commercial whaling, but rather a proposal on catch limits. This might be very different from general understanding about so-called moratorium or ban on commercial whaling. The actual purpose of international convention of a regulation of whaling might be reviewed so that we make certain that we understand the actual purpose of the convention itself, which was adopted almost 70 years ago. The convention, the final paragraph of the convention preamble says, having decided to conclude a convention to provide for the proper conservation of whale stocks and thus make possible the orderly development of the whaling industry. The latter part is a very old language. The orderly development of the whaling industry can be probably paraphrased like a sustainable use of whales. Let me show you some of the other languages that might be very different from general understanding about legal framework of whaling. And recently, International Court of Justice, about a year ago, International Court of Justice has made a conclusion that Japan's research whaling activities in Antarctic Ocean is outside the scope of the convention itself. However, there are many paragraphs in the judgment that has not been well understood or shown, and some of them might be useful to have a quick review here. The first one, the ICJ judgment said the objective of the ICRW, the Convention for the International Whaling Commission, are further indicated in the final paragraph of a preamble, which states that the convention parties decided to conclude a convention to provide for the proper conservation of whale stocks and thus make possible the orderly development of the whaling industry. Amendments to the schedule and the recommendations by the IWC may put the emphasis on one or the other objectives pursued by the convention, but cannot alter its object and the purposes. What this is talking about is so-called whaling moratorium, which I just introduced. The true language is oftentimes understood as a ban of whaling. And this particular paragraph has, I guess, two meanings. One is even though the adoption of a so-called moratorium is oftentimes understood as a total ban of whaling, it's not. And at the same time, if it is, even if it is, still the convention prevails over the schedule language. This is paragraph 94 of judgment by International Court of Justice. The court also said in the court view, the fact that the moratorium involves a sale, I mean the program, this is a research whaling program, involves the sale of whale meat, and thus the use of proceeds to fund research is not sufficient taken alone to cause a special permit is research activities, to fall outside Article 3. So it's a very indirect saying, but in a plain language, it says even if you sell the meat after the research activity, it doesn't mean the research is not the research, it's still research. That's the whole meaning of this paragraph or judgment by International Court of Justice. And paragraph 224 of International Court of Justice judgment also says something like this. The court finds that the use of lethal sampling per se is not unreasonable in relation to the research objectives of JARPA 2. So the ICJ judgment might have been understood as a prohibition of research activities that involve lethal sampling. That's not the case. It is very clearly shown, as you can see from this paragraph 224. This is also another paragraph from International Court of Justice judgment of last year. Skip the first part, and it is to be expected that Japan will take account of the reasoning and conclusion contained in this judgment as it will evaluate the possibility of granting any future permits under Article 8, Paragraph 1 of the Convention. The Convention is the International Whaling Convention. So, this paragraph 246 clearly presupposes that there could be another research whaling activities. It only says that Japan or any other countries, when they plan or decide to conduct the research activities, they need to take into account of contents of ICJ decision. Oftentimes, ICJ decision is portrayed as a total prohibition of research activities. However, the actual contents could be seen as very different from general impression the general public might have about the ICJ decision. Because we have been seeing a lot of words, I will show you some pictures. Do you think those animals are either resource or not? It depends on your perspective. Kangaroos are oftentimes seen as just wildlife for people outside of Australia, but it is also well known that there are steaks, sausages, and many products from kangaroo. So it's a resource, in a sense. And is that elk deer? Yeah, and the deer is also part of a wildlife. And in some countries, it's regarded as a special animal, including Japan. In some part of Japan, have any of you ever been to Nara city in Japan? That's sort of a second oldest city after Kyoto. And wild deers are just walking around freely, and because they are deemed as messengers of God. However, I know very well that in the United States, the deers are subject to hunting, and that's fine with us, as long as we will not impose our own thinking to each other. And snake, this one. And in a Christian culture, oftentimes snakes are regarded as something, should I say, evil, or not a very favorable animal in many senses. In many of the Japanese shrines, especially the white snakes, are regarded as messengers of God. And this one on the top right side is actually head of a minke whale. And for some people, this might be a special animal, charismatic fauna. And for other people, this might be just a resource. So there are many different cultures and ethics, and you might have a different opinion about a particular animal or their role in your society. However, I think the general rule is you will not impose your own way of thinking to others. I have a very lovely golden retriever back home, and one of my neighbor countries actually eat dogs. But I know that we shouldn't impose our way of thinking as long as it's sustainable and humane. This is also a picture taken from one of the festivals in Japan, and it might be difficult to see, but these are actually portray deer. And deer is also a subject to hunt in this country and other places. And in some part of Japan, deer is also regarded as a messenger's god. And that's just a cultural difference. Okay. I'll try to show you the difference between so-called, well, I shouldn't say so-called, the scientific research activities and the commercial difference between scientific research activities and commercial whaling activities. Let's say where is the castle? Here, okay. This area surrounded by circle is a sort of a high density area of a distribution of whales. And outside of this circle is a low density area. And in the research activities, research vessels are supposed to go through both areas so that there will be a wide coverage of collection of scientific data. And this is how Japanese research whalings are conducted in essence. On the other hand, in the commercial whaling activities, they just go straight to the highest density area and take whales and go straight back to home. Because taking whales outside those areas is not just viable from an economical point of view. And this is one of the basic differences between scientific whaling and research whaling. And oftentimes these are not well known or ignored. And Japan's position could be summarized as follows. And first of all, the sustainable utilization of all living marine resources, including whales. We support the sustainable utilization. That means we don't like to deplete whale species or any other marine living resources. And conservation and management based on the best scientific information available. That's why we conduct a scientific whaling. That's why we send a large number of scientists to the Scientific Committee of International Whaling Commission and submit a large number of scientific papers for discussion. And we only support regulated and controlled utilization of only abundant whale species. We are 100% behind the protection of a depleted species. Like right here. Whoops. Did I do something wrong? And yeah, I don't need to repeat, but whaling culture exists in many different countries, including the state of Alaska in the United States. And that should be respected as long as it's sustainable. And sometimes the too much protection of a part of a marine ecosystem even destroys the balance of a marine ecosystem. And the best way, scientifically saying, is to utilize all the aspects of a marine ecosystem in an equal manner. And whaling, I'm wrapping up, is now become the symbol of science-based management. And oftentimes this is also handled as animal rights movement or part of animal rights movement. However, Japan stands on the principle of sustainable utilization, and cultural differences needs to be respected. But the conflict still continues because sometimes misguided public opinion, and which is strengthened by the press coverage. And many non-governmental organizations are living on the controversy, unfortunately. Not all. I know very good non-governmental organizations. And the politicians and even some government are oftentimes energized by those controversy. And there are some aspects in my own government too. This is a picture from International Whaling Commission, and I tried to find myself somewhere, but I couldn't. So, thank you very much for listening, and looking forward to some. Can I close this one for you? Okay, this way.
Thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank Tulane once again for giving me the opportunity to speak on whaling. It might seem like a small thing, but no pun intended, I cut my teeth on this issue when I was a young man with more hair that was a different color, and spent a lot of time on whaling issues. And in recent years, there hasn't been much interest in whaling issues, despite the fact that, as the Commissioner points out, it's an issue that in the area of international law is extremely interesting and a great case study to look at the conflation of law and ethics and politics beyond the fact that we're talking about extremely remarkable species. And so I look forward to the opportunity to engage in this discussion. What I'd like to talk about today is in some ways responding to the Commissioner's remarks and proposing a way forward for the International Convention on the Regulation of Whaling in the 21st century. Now, the ICRW and the body that implements it, the International Whaling Commission, is remarkable in a couple ways, or signal in a couple of ways. First of all, it is the oldest existing multilateral environmental regime that we have in the world. Okay, it's been around for 70 years. Second of all, as the Commissioner has noted, at least obliquely, it's probably the most messed up one that we have. He used the term dysfunctional. He's not alone in using that term, right? This is comments from some academics using exactly the same language. Comments from the commissioners themselves and politicians, right, on its last legs. According to Norway's ambassador, dysfunctional in other terms. Our commissioner, fundamentally broken, and my less than articulate characterization a couple years ago in an article about this regime. In my opinion, there's two fundamental reasons that the IWC is this dysfunctional, okay? And I'd like to look at each one of those as a way of then talking about how we move forward. The first reason I believe that this regime is so non-viable at this point is that the history of over-harvesting of these species that occurred under this regime for most of its history. As the Commissioner points out, the preamble, it talks about the fact that we created this regime because we had a history of over-harvesting of whales before the regime was created, before World War II. And we drove many species to the point of extinction, including the largest species that's ever existed on Earth, the blue whale, to levels that were virtually non-recoverable. So we established this regime, 15 whaling countries, to ostensibly ensure, as I agree with the Commissioner, that we could proceed in the future with sustainable utilization of whales as a resource. And then we simply ignored those admonitions. Year after year, Japan, the United States, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, ignored the recommendations of the scientific commission that's established, scientific committee of the ICRW, and which would set quotas on the number of whales that should be taken, and took more. Okay, and that created a fundamental mistrust among non-governmental organizations, members of the public, governments, etc., that we could trust whaling countries to engage in sustainable whaling. And that's one of the issues and one of the kind of residual sources of mistrust that makes the IWC so dysfunctional. So if we are to proceed with whaling in the future, and I want to talk about how I think that could be done, one of the hallmarks of that has to be is establishing principles that re-establish trust between non-whaling and whaling countries in moving forward. Second reason that the IWC is dysfunctional, in my opinion, and perhaps even more important, is that two of the three camps in the IWC, and make no doubt there are three camps in the IWC. One is what we call the preservationist camp, and these are countries supported by non-governmental organizations such as World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace, who believe that even if you can establish that whales can be taken sustainably, we shouldn't take them. Okay? And it's on grounds that the Commissioner talked about. Ethics. There are people who believe that whales are incredibly sentient species with large brains that can form communities, and as a consequence, we shouldn't take them, even if we can do it in a sustainable fashion. And that's the preservationist camp. And it's represented by countries such as Australia, New Zealand, at times the United States. Okay? The second camp is the conservationist camp, and these are countries that believe that if you can prove that whaling can be done sustainably, we should proceed. And then there's the pro-whaling countries such as Japan and Iceland. One of the things that's been historically true in the IWC in the last 50 years is that the preservationist camp and the pro-whaling camp have engaged in widespread duplicity. And I want to outline how that's happened historically on both sides of the equation and why that's created such massive distrust and hate of the kind that the Commissioner describes. Historically, one of the points of dishonesty is even reporting how many whales have been taken. Okay? For example, between 1948 and 1973, the former Soviet Union killed 48,000 humpback whales. It tendered reports that it had killed 2,700. Okay? Slight difference. Okay? Makes it very difficult from a standpoint of using the sophisticated formulas we use to assess sustainability, right? Garbage in, garbage out. It drove the once healthy humpback populations in areas such as Australia and New Zealand to the point of extinction. Okay, and this was blatant dishonesty, and this was there were underreporting done by the Soviets in the case of blue whales, sperm whales, and many other endangered species. So that's one source of dishonesty in the IWC. Another source of dishonesty has been vote buying, and this has been done by both sides. The IWC works as one country, one vote. So if you're Tonga or you're the United States or Japan, you get the same number of votes. And what this has done is it's encouraged the pro-whaling and the preservationist forces to bring new countries in to vote for their side and also to persuade current countries to vote for their side. And they've done this through bribery, okay? Pure and simple. Let me give you a couple of examples. A former Greenpeace consultant recounted that there was a plan to add at least 6 new anti-whaling countries between 1978 to 1982 through the paying of annual dues, the drafting of membership documents, and the naming of commissioners. Okay? And this was done. And the United States was engaged in this. The Seychelles, the country that actually proposed the moratorium on commercial whaling, was brought in by the United States with promises of overseas development assistance. And we all know that now. Okay? Commissioner can't say that. I'm an academic. There's nothing that people can do to me. So I will tell you that that was clearly been done. But not just on that side. Okay? The Japanese have regularly admitted the fact that they have been engaged in these kind of activities also. No, why won't this move? There we go. Hold on. This was a comment by the International Director of the Fisheries Agency in 2001. Japan does not have military power. You may dispatch military power to East Timor, but that's not the case for Japan. Our means is diplomatic communication and overseas development assistance. Okay? In 2010, the London Times engaged in a sting operation in which they took one of the reporters and represented him as a wealthy Swiss billionaire. Okay? He went to 6 countries that are currently members, small countries that are members of the International Whaling Commission, and offered them bribes to vote against whaling operations. All 6 of them, delegates from all 6 of those countries, told him that they would only do so if he would pay them more than the Japanese were paying him. Okay? It's dishonesty. Okay? And what it does is it takes a regime and it fundamentally destroys its ability to operate because nobody trusts anybody else. Okay? Some of this happens in other regimes, but nobody does it better than the IWC. Okay? It's been a source of dysfunctionality, to put it mildly, for a long time. Some of the most egregious acts, though, in terms of dishonesty, revolve around the imposition of this moratorium that the Commissioner talked about. Okay? First act of dishonesty were the countries that put the moratorium in place. Okay? I was part of this movement, so I can tell you, again, what was involved. We had a regime that, as the Commissioner quite correctly notes, is not a preservationist regime. The regime contemplates that if you can take whales sustainably, you have a right to take whales. Okay? Some of us may disagree with that. I do. I'm in the preservationist camp. Okay? But this is the damn treaty, okay, that people agreed to. Okay? And its language is clear. And as the ICJ pointed out, you cannot defeat its object and purpose. We could start over again if we wanted, but we're not. We have this regime in place. NGOs and some preservationist countries faced that reality and said, well, how can we still kill the whaling industry? I know what we'll do. We'll put into place a moratorium. Okay? And what we'll hope will happen is that all of these companies that are engaged in whaling will be shut down and eventually starved of capital, and they'll go away. Okay? They'll move to other fisheries. Okay? Problem solved. And so it was a blatant political ploy. Okay? Well, that kind of bad faith, of course, begets more bad faith. And again, it's the reason that this regime is so dysfunctional. How did whaling countries respond? Well, some of them took reservations. They objected to the moratorium, which they're allowed to do under the treaty. Japan did so. It was then threatened by the United States with sanctions, and so it dropped the objection. Okay? Norway and Iceland, complicated reasons, did not. But then Japan said, there's an alternative here, and that's Article 8, okay, the research whaling exception, right, which we talked about before, right, which is breathtaking in its expansiveness. It allows a country ostensibly unilaterally to engage in research whaling under these parameters, right? Japan outfitted all of the boats that were killing whales before and turned them into research vessels, okay? And they went out and did the same thing that they were before, killing whales, okay? Ostensibly for research. Now, Japan and virtually every other country in the world, prior to the imposition of the moratorium, didn't engage in research whaling. There was very little of it, okay? There were incidents of it, but it was very small scale. Is it a coincidence that Japan at this point decided that they were all of a sudden had this intense interest in studying cetaceans? I would suggest no. Okay? This, again, is the disingenuousness of the International Whaling Commission. It was a response to disingenuousness by the preservationist camp, but nonetheless, it's disingenuous. And it's created the kind of animus that makes it virtually impossible for these countries to find a way forward and to work together. Okay? So, in the context of research whaling, unfortunately, I believe that Japan's response to the International Court of Justice's ruling last year just exacerbates the current situation in terms of the mistrust of the parties. First of all, it needs to be clear that the ICJ issued a stinging rebuke in terms of Japan's research program. The Commissioner has shown you some of the language from the decision. I want to show you a couple of other provisions. Paragraph 219, okay, talks about the research that has come out of this research expedition, concluding these papers, the two peer-reviewed papers, and these are two over many, many years, two peer-reviewed papers, do not relate to the objectives of the research expedition, and has involved the killing of about 3,600 minke whales. The scientific output to date appears limited. Okay, so questions the importance of the scientific research that's being done in this context. But most importantly, it questions the motivations for this scientific research. Paragraph 156 says the sample sizes and the launch date were not driven by strictly scientific considerations. These weaknesses give weight to the contrary theory advanced by Australia that Japan's priority was to maintain whaling operations without any pause. Okay? It's a searing indictment of the motivations of Japan in terms of engaging in research whaling. And it again is redolent of the bad faith that the parties and the NGOs in the ICRW have always exercised. Paragraph 178. The selection of a 12-year research period for fin whales and humpback whales is one factor that casts doubt on the centrality of the objectives that Japan highlights to justify the minke whale size of 850. Okay. At this point, then, the court held that what we needed to do was to engage in a reasonability test. And this was the first time that the court had said this, that countries were not simply able, under Article 8, to decide how many whales they think should be taken in research proposals, but rather must utilize an objective approach and a reasonability approach. Okay? And Japan, at the end of this decision, indicated that it would comply with the ICJ's decision. But I would suggest that the way that it is complying is likely to simply add fuel to the fire of the animus between these parties and make it impossible for the IWC to fix itself. Okay? One of the things that came out of this proposal was or this decision was a resolution by the IWC in 2014. And as you can see, it requested that no special permits for the taking of whales under Article 8 be permitted until the Scientific Commission had employed and applied the criteria that the ICJ had set forth in its decision. Okay, that could not take place before 2016. Okay, and that's what the resolution called for, and it was passed. Okay, and as you can see here, it talks about the criteria that the Scientific Committee should utilize. Instead, Japan indicated that it would re-engage in research whaling starting in 2015, and it established a new program to take 333 minke whales annually through 2027. Okay, and it gave lip service in some ways. It indicated that it would submit its proposals to the Scientific Committee again, but it made it clear that at the end of the day, it would unilaterally decide if it will continue to kill whales. Okay, I think that's an absurd interpretation of the ICJ decision. If you think about it, the ICJ said that we must look at scientific research whaling proposals objectively, right, and use a test of reasonability. What Japan is saying is that it inures to its responsibility and authority both the ability to formulate the research proposal and to decide itself if it's objectively reasonable. Okay? First of all, that makes no sense from a standpoint of utilizing tests of reasonability. And all of you that are domestic lawyers know that that's not how it works at the domestic level. And it's not usually how it works at the international level. Second of all, more importantly, it drains the decision-making that Japan is conducting of all legitimacy. Okay, which means that it can't possibly help us to heal these huge wounds of the IWC that makes it impossible for this organization to be functional. So one of the things that I think is clear, if you look at the decision in the ICJ, and its discussion of objective and reasonable tests, okay, is this language on page 18, which talks about a matter for objective determination in light of the evidence of the facts as evidence to the guidelines and resolutions of the scientific committee and the commission. What we should do as a first step, what Japan should agree to do, in my opinion, to help heal the wounds of the IWC, is to agree to submit its proposal. First of all, suspend operations for 2015 to 2016, submit its proposal to the scientific committee, consistent with the resolution that's been passed by the IWC, and agree to comply with the recommendations of the scientific committee as to whether it should proceed with its expedition and under what conditions. Okay? In this way, there would be an independent assessment of the reasonability of its approach, and it would provide the kind of consensus among the parties that would allow the IWC to start to proceed in the future as a functional institution. Now, the alternative, of course, is for Japan to simply proceed unilaterally and Australia to object and argue that it's not reasonable and to go back to the International Court of Justice. Okay? But think about it for a second. Who should be assessing the scientific merits of a whaling proposal? A bunch of judges with no background in whaling biology, or the scientific committee of the International Whaling Commission, right? It doesn't make sense for this to get kicked back to the ICJ from a standpoint of scientific validity. And it's my hope that Japan will acknowledge that and reverse the course of its decision in terms of scientific research whaling. Now, in the longer term, there has to be give on the other side. The preservationist camp has to acknowledge that it has lost. Okay? It cannot stop whaling. Okay? It may stop someday. Okay, it will stop someday. I think there's 1% of people in Japan that consume whale meat at this point. Okay, this industry will end on its own, but it won't stop now. Okay, and if the preservationist camp continues to engage in the same conduct, it'll get the same results. Japan will continue to engage in scientific research, which will facilitate killing hundreds and hundreds of whales, unregulated. Okay? Norway and Iceland will continue to engage in their operations. Okay? So the preservationist camp needs to compromise and acknowledge that we need to resume commercial whaling under strict regulation by the International Whaling Commission. Okay? My preservationist friends will kill me for saying that, but that's what I believe needs to be done. A good starting point for this was a decision that was proposed in 2010 in the International Whaling Commission called the Draft Consensus Decision. Okay? And these were some of its provisions that I think would be a good starting point for negotiations between Japan, Iceland, and Norway, and the preservationist and conservationist camps. It calls for retaining the moratorium on commercial whaling. The reason that that's important is, given this history of over-harvesting, dishonest reporting, etc., we can't lift the moratorium tomorrow. Okay? We need to have a trial run, as it were, of sustainable whaling over the course of the next decade to determine if it works, and then we can talk about lifting the moratorium. Second of all, suspend immediately for a 10-year period unilaterally determined whaling, research whaling, whaling under objections, etc., all gone. Okay? Bring all whaling authorized by member governments under the control of the International Whaling Commission. Establish caps for the next 10 years based on a formula that's been established in the scientific committee called the Revised Management Procedure. This procedure actually would permit Japan to take more whales than are being taken under the scientific research whaling exception. The difference is that it would be done in a regulated fashion based on sound science and based on a consensus of the parties to the IWC, as opposed to a party unilaterally proceeding as Japan does in terms of its Article 8 operations. Okay? And there's some other provisions that one could look at. Okay? That, I think, is the way forward in terms of commercial large-scale whaling. Now, finally, how much time do I have left? Okay, really quickly. Second thing that the IWC needs to do is address the plight of small cetaceans. Okay? And the commissioners talked a bit about this. There's 67 species of small cetaceans. They range in size from nearly 30 feet in the case of killer whales down to black dolphins in Chile, which are less than 2 feet, okay, in length. The distinction between these large and small cetaceans is largely an arbitrary one. Okay? For example, one of the species that's deemed a small cetacean, the Baird's beaked whale, is actually larger than minke whales, killer whales, and Atlantic bottlenose whales, all of which are regulated under the IWC. Okay? But historically, Japan and some other countries have resisted the IWC regulating the exploitation and the threats to small cetaceans. Okay? And these threats are huge in terms of these species. There's lots of direct exploitation. For example, the Japanese fleet took 67% of Dell's porpoises off the North Pacific coast between 87 and 1990. 67%. A wholly unsustainable take, okay? And they're certainly not alone in terms of doing this. In South America, Peruvians may be killing up to 50,000 small cetaceans annually. Chile's crab industry uses Commerson's dolphins as crab bait in their operations, as does Brazil, okay? And they've driven the Commerson's dolphin virtually to the point of extinction. Okay? Small cetaceans also face threats from climate change, pollution, incidental catch and fishing nets. Hundreds of thousands, for example, were killed in the Eastern Pacific in the pursuit of other species. Okay? The IWC traditionally has some countries have sought to regulate the taking of small cetaceans. Countries like Japan have opposed it for a couple of reasons. First of all, they've argued that the IWC doesn't have authorization to do this, to regulate these cetaceans, because there's something called the nomenclature of whales. Okay? And this was an annex that was attached to the primary treaty when the treaty was created. And it lists species that were traditionally killed by the whaling industry in different languages, based on all the official languages of the treaty. And they argue that that creates a limit to species that can be regulated under the ICRW. They also cite Article 56 of the Law of the Sea Convention that talks about the rights of countries within their 200-mile exclusive economic zones to regulate resources. And they argue that most of these species are found in those zones and thus should be regulated by the domestic authorities. I think these arguments are wrong for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you look at the nomenclature, okay, when the parties created it, it was denominated a guide. Okay, and but if you use the plain means of interpreting language, a guide is exactly that. It guides you. Okay, it assists. It is not something that implies legal binding implications. Second of all, when the countries wanted something to be legally binding that they attached to the treaty, they used language that indicated that. Okay, the schedule that the commissioner pointed to that regulates the catch limits and the ways you kill whales, etc., was denominated by the parties in the negotiations as an integral part of the treaty. Okay? The nomenclature was not. To that extent, I believe it doesn't limit which whales can be taken under the treaty. And so that argument, I think, is wrong. Second of all, Article 56 of UNCLOS that's often cited conveniently ignores Article 65. Okay? And Article 65, as you can see in the underlying language, says, in the case of cetaceans, countries are required to work through the appropriate international organizations for their conservation, management, and study. Japan, at the 2001 IWC, acknowledged that the IWC was the appropriate organization for the regulation of whaling. Many other countries have. The Rio Conference in 1992 also indicated that. To that extent, coastal nations, and as you can see under Article 20, anybody engaged in operations that might threaten small cetaceans on the high seas are required to work through the IWC. Given the fact that many, many, many more small cetaceans are being threatened by direct exploitation and anthropogenic factors such as pollution, than the commercial harvest. If the IWC is to be a relevant and viable institution in the 21st century, it needs to acknowledge this and it needs to assert jurisdiction. By doing so, and by removing the the hindrance of the commercial whaling battles, this regime can start to move to issues that are more relevant in the 21st century, and it may be possible at some point in the future that the commissioner and the preservationist camp can actually break bread together at future meetings. That's my hope, and this is my vision for how that might be effectuated. Thank you very much.
Well, I think it was really interesting. I actually have a question I wanted to start this off on. I actually have two questions, but one is, do you believe that the provisions that apply to subsistence whaling have equally been disingenuous the way they've implemented? If many of you don't know, the United States has an Aboriginal subsistence whaling program for bowhead whales by Inuits in Alaska, as do the Russians, and they take a significant number of bowhead, which are one of the most endangered species in the world. There are also a lot of others, and Greenland recently had a zero quota, but took them anyway. So, I mean, do you think that's equally problematic? Do you think that has been forced by this disingenuousness?
Yeah, it's rank hypocrisy by the U.S. government, okay? But I don't represent the U.S. government, okay? Absolutely. It's been driven primarily by domestic politics, okay? One could make a distinction between subsistence whaling and argue that that's whaling in which it's critical for the populations to exist. And if one can establish that, one could make a distinction, okay? I'm not certain that, especially in contemporary times, that one can make that distinction, okay? But even if you can, in my mind, it's a distraction, and it's undercut the U.S.'s ability to speak with a moral voice on this issue.
Yeah. I think dysfunctional nature of IWC's business is coming sort of all the time. And even if we recognize some conservation programs or conservation issues to be discussed, including Aboriginal whaling, political situation of IWC actually prevents those players to actually discuss those issues. And unless the culture of IWC itself changes, there will be no way out. And IWC has been facing this kind of impasse for a long, long time. And one of proposal that just explained by Dr. Byrne is actually, as far as I remember, the fourth trial of similar peacemaking. And all four peacemaking activities just failed. And this organization is facing a very critical point, and it actually moved from annual meeting to a biannual meeting recent years, because they don't see any reasons to meet every year, because they're just repeating the same controversy year after year and creating nothing. And this organization is one of the rare species of very dysfunctional international organization. That's another reason the IWC itself, even if it's well, I should say that IWC should be seen from that perspective too, not just rather than conservation and management.
Well, and to make this observation, and I'll ask you this question, and then I'll open it up. 20 years ago, when I did my research, actually my conclusion was exactly what you said, which was a prediction that the IWC would actually explode or implode and cease to exist, and then whaling would be totally non-regulated, and you would have even worse situation than you could have if it was a regulated institution. And yet it still exists. So what is it you think is, why is it, even if it's dysfunctional, continuing down the road when the countries could pull out? And if they pulled out of the convention, they would be free to do whatever the heck they wanted, and nobody could stop them from doing anything. So because
it's not true. Article 65, the commissioner probably has a different interpretation. My interpretation is, okay, they've tried to do this. Norway and some others tried to create NAMCO. Well, NAMCO still exists, but they tried to say that their Article 65 obligations could be met by this alternative organization called the North Atlantic Marine Mammal Commission. And it has a scientific committee, and they pass resolutions, and it kind of looks like the IWC, but it was a whalers camp, right? And the reason they felt the need to do that, instead of just proceeding with unilateral whaling, is they're parties to the Law of the Sea Convention. Unlike the United States, I might point out, right? We're not even part of this treaty, right? Shamefully, okay? But Japan is, and Norway is, and I believe they both recognize their legal obligations under the treaty to engage when it comes to cetaceans with the appropriate organizations, okay? And if you eliminate the IWC, you need an appropriate organization, right? At NAMCO, eventually, everybody realized that it was part of the same pattern of dishonesty, right? And Norway withdrew its support for NAMCO as an alternative. Japan had talked about in the 80s establishing PAMCO, this Pacific one, but didn't do so for the same reason. So I think that's why. I think Japan is in a straitjacket because it had the decency to ratify this convention and is subject to Article 65.
Do you agree, or?
Well, Norway is still a member of NAMCO.
Yeah, but they've agreed it's not going to be an alternative.
Yeah, NAMCO is a regional organization as opposed to International Whaling Commission, which is global. And as you can see, the Article 65, okay, you can see the plural international organizations, and technically or legally speaking, it is possible to establish another global international organization to manage whaling. However, it's not happening yet, maybe. And if IWC situation is bad enough, that might be the direction that we might be seeing. But from my government perspective, we could have withdrawn from IWC anytime. And there are many voices back home that we should not stay in IWC anymore because of that dysfunctional nature. But as a government, we decided to stay because we think we need a global management organization for whaling activities. And the whaling business or whaling industry, its future is unclear. However, because of our expanding world populations, they are quite possible that many of the developing countries might decide to take some whales in their waters. In that situation, we need a global organization to manage the situation. And that's one of the reasons we continue to stay in this organization, knowing it's very difficult for us to play a role in this organization. So I think we might be coming to some critical point in the very near future.
Oliver, you have a question?
Yeah, I've learned so much in this session. I want to thank you both for it. But what emerges for me, is oversimplified, is that there's a possibility of a Morishita Burns solution that could be arrived at perhaps in this room, but certainly outside the context of the politics of this. And I sense that you agree that there should be commercial whaling, and it should be done on a scientific basis, and it should be done in the context of a global managed, regulated system. I think those three things I heard both from you, Mr. Morishita, and you, Professor Burns, right? So if that's true, what is the sticking point? It seems to me there are two sticking points. One of which is whether a whaling nation, be it Japan or another, is willing to accept the scientific conclusions of the global organization, or whether it's going to make its own conclusions and go forward, or I'll drop the commission. Okay, is it going to really accept the scientific conclusion, i.e. the quotas and the rest of it, of the scientific body? That seems to be the sticking point in Japan's side. And if I were Japan, I would look with skepticism about this 10-year, we're going to keep it in place and then we'll decide to open it up. It seems to me that's like asking Japan to give it up for 10 years, and that's a hard ask. So I wonder whether, if I were, in the room just watching you folks talk, back and forth, and you couldn't leave the room until you left with a piece of paper you both signed, okay? I'll bring in the food, I'll bring in the rest of the stuff. You can't even go to the bathroom. You've got to work this through. Wouldn't it come out like Japan agreeing, and other whaling nations, to a management scheme that was truly independently scientifically verified, and it would include being able to proceed expeditiously with that system without some interim. So Japan could move into the commercial zone it wants to be, and you could move to the regulated berth that you both say you want. I don't know why that isn't achievable outside the politics of it. Why that isn't achievable, is it even achievable in this room? That's my question.
Well, I think the problem is that there...
I'd like to...
Oh, sorry.
Please,
Go
I'd like
ahead.
to let them respond to this. And could I ask this? When you respond, if you stand, I have a very difficult time hearing either of you. So I don't know who would like to respond to that. But
You want to start?
Okay. Thank you very much for that observation. And you can hear me now?
yes, thank you.
Good. Okay. Actually, we are supportive of any regulated whaling regime in a global sense. And the problem we have been seeing is in the International Whaling Commission, there are large camp of countries which will not accept any whaling in any circumstances. And as long as they are some sizable portion of International Whaling Commission, the compromise proposal you have just described cannot survive, and that's the current situation. And again, if we can establish a system where all the whaling are under global regulation and science-based, we are happy to accept that. But the problem is there are many countries which cannot accept any whaling. And the final compromise proposal was dead on arrival because right before its proposal, Australia wrote that into the case of ICJ because just accepting single whales to be killed was not acceptable for Australian Republic. So as long as they occupy a sizable portion of the International Whaling Commission, unfortunately, your proposal will not be
Well,
Fortunately, Australia is one country, and there's 88 parties to the ICJ. I think that there are a
the IWC to the ICJ.
I'm sorry, the IWC. There are a number of countries that are fluid when it comes to the preservationist, conservationist camp. The United States is a perfect example of it. It varies. You'd be surprised that when George W. Bush was in power and we had a commissioner from Texas, that it was a little more fluid and flexible in terms of our approach. But even now, in the Obama administration, there's some fluidity and there's some possible compromise that would occur. I think there is enough of the kind of shaky preservationists that could be brought into the conservationist camp under the right circumstances that we could get this done. Now, one proviso is, and this, the devil's always in the details with these things, right, is because of this history of mistrust, okay, establishing what the algorithm is. We use this thing called the catch-limit algorithm, this complicated computer formula. It's based on assumptions of what you feed into it and what's pertinent, right? There remains some serious issues between, I think, at least in the last couple of years I saw, between Japan and some other countries in terms of the relevance of things like anthropogenic climate change and how precautionary we should tune the algorithm, okay, and what the numbers should be. it's my hope that if there was an acknowledgement that RCAP is willing to move in good faith and acknowledge that we're going to have to drop this concept of no whales being taken, that we could find compromises in terms of those kind of things. But it's a tough slog, but it's got to look better than this.
Let me make maybe a silly observation. You're both sitting at the most distant places in the world that you could conceive of. I think the median road that perhaps the preservationists need to look at, and perhaps the conservationists, is a humanitarian way. I mean, as somebody who would love, I'd hate the idea, personally, of even one whale being killed. But I also am realistic, as you are, that it's going to happen. So the median road, it seems, to get the preservationists on board to what is being suggested is, okay, how can we do this? And I'm completely ignorant of how you would humanely kill a whale. But I know, for instance, that in Japan they do these very barbaric ways of killing porpoises and dolphin. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, Mr. Morishita, is you personally seem to be talking about, when I hear you talk, you talked about both kind of sustainability and humanitarian. Personally, I think that's how you feel. But when you talked about Japan's position, it was sustainability, the utilization, conservation and management, and regulated utilization. So let me ask you, was I missing something? I mean, is there a humanitarian element? Humanitarian meaning, you know what I mean? Is there a humanitarian element to Japan's position?
Yes, there is a discussion in the International Whaling Commission about humane killing techniques. And we are, including Japan, all the whaling countries are under the obligation to be engaged in this discussion. And we have been providing the data and also our effort to shorten the time of death as much as possible. And there are the standard in the Scientific Committee of International Whaling Commission. And however, oftentimes the number for data is treated quite emotionally. And rather than looking at the progress of that activities, it always, the worst part is emphasized so that the discussion itself sometimes collapses. And I think my point is that we are serious about animal welfare aspect. And as long as you are killing any kind of animal for use, that should be respected. And that's why we have adopted all the recommendations by international whaling in the past, like explosive harpoons and other techniques to shorten the time of death as much as possible. And the time of death has been improved, and that's the record of the Scientific Committee over the years. So we are making an effort, and we are serious about that issue.
Thank you.
I think you were first, and then...
For an international commission, what does it take to be on such a commission? What preservationist organization, I mean, who do you represent, or what clout, if you're not a country that is involved in something like that? Where does the clout come from for a person or an organization to be a member of such an international commission? And does it have something to do with, I heard mentioned, law of the sea?
Well, it's lobbying. It's more lobbying by preservationists of certain countries, is it not? And expenditure of funds. You're not actually a member of the IWC. It's just that certain...
Who are the members of the IWC?
Just the countries who are signatories to the convention. Yes. So like with any other fisheries manual, like the International Convention for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, is another one, and the NGOs go to those meetings and lobby for various things, and they have more power with some countries than they do with other countries. They have more sympathies from certain countries. So, I mean, it's mainly not that you're a participating member, but that you may be lobbying for a certain constituency from those countries. And so that's the way it works.
That's true for industry as well. I mean,
Right.
industry
No,
there-
the industry goes as well. I mean, tuna industry goes to the tuna, you know, it's why we take yellowfin but not bluefin. But we still take yellowfin and take bluefin as a bycatch of yellowfin. So it's you know.
And sometimes these people are on the delegations, you know, and our commissioner, for example, is a former NGO person. So there's some fluidity between the NGO community and the government, and the NGO people can actually be delegates to and represent countries, and they do sometimes. And part of the scandal of the vote buying over the years has been buying countries and then appointing their commissioners as people that are sympathetic to your cause. You know, Japan has done it, so has our side.
This is for Mr. Morishita. So Japan is the population is a third the size of the U.S., but it's like 1/50th of the size. So you are an ocean country. How much of your position on whaling do you think is driven by nationality and some kind of pride, symbolic thing, just because that's an existential thing for you? And how much of it do you think is driven by your economic needs?
Okay. I think at the beginning of our discussion at the International Whaling Commission 60, 70 years ago, that was a very serious economic issue. And especially after World War II, the animal protein was very shortage in our country, and actually United States government actually encouraged that time to Japan to go back to whaling business to supplement the animal protein. However, the whaling business itself becomes smaller and smaller, and these days it's a very small portion of animal protein provision if you are talking about the amount of protein provided by the whaling industry. But at the same time, so the symbolic side of whaling issue becomes so inflated to become larger. But even those people who are not eating whale meat back in Japan think that this is insult to Japan, or the anti-whaling countries are inconsistent because they are killing other animals and saying to Japan that don't kill whales. So the character of the issue has gone through some transition from actual issue of sustainability of industry to more of a philosophic changes, philosophic differences. And some people say even if we lose the whole whaling industry sometime in the future, still we should come to the whaling, International Whaling Commission and support the right for whale killing or whale hunting, because it's a legitimate right for some people, and it's not different from any hunting activities as long as it follows scientific advice and other advice.
That's,
Are we up time?
oh, please,
I-
one more.
One more? Go ahead.
I just wanted to speak to your hypothetical science-based global regulation. I wanted to speak to your hypothetical science-based global regulation and management of whaling. That's a great concept, and if that were the case, then it has to be based on the facts about the health of a population of whales in a particular ecosystem. Not some middle ground of opinions between nations worldwide. Truth is not a middle ground. I know law is sometimes a weighing of a balance, but I'm a scientist, and if the truth is over here...
That's why the proposal hinges on making it a scientific determination. The problem is the parameters of the science. As Will points out, there's a lot of dispute of what the scientific metrics should be.
Yeah, there is in fact. But goes beyond that. You have a practical problem, which is that Japan has appointed itself, with all due respect, because they're the ones that are down, I'm speaking of the Southern Ocean, for example, where I have been down there while Kyoto Senpaku's ships have been down there. And they've basically, in practice, essentially appointed themselves and are, de facto, the only ones down there to survey populations. And it could be done non-lethally. The research that might require lethal sampling, such as investigation of concentrations of heavy metals in tissues, and how that bears on the safety of using them for food. There's been a paucity of that kind of research that has come out of the 1,000 or more whales that Japan announces they've been killing in the Southern Ocean, for example. So we have the ultimate conflict of interest in that I'm speaking now of the Southern Ocean, the only nations down there able and equipped, and not by government research funding, but by private companies such as Kyoto Senpaku, the only ones down there able to do a serious scientific population survey are the ones that want to kill them for commercial purposes. So you don't really have a good basis to make your scientific conclusions, even though that
I understand the problem. It seems to me, though, if you wanted to create a capacity for doing scientific work, there are many ways to do that. I mean, in the water pollution area, we rely on industry to report their discharges. I mean, there are ways to develop the capacity to do the science, either through observers on the ships, protocols, and the rest of it. Japan would need to be willing to accept that kind of internationalization of what they're doing, and we would there has to be a little trust on both sides, but you could imagine the mechanism, certainly, even though they're the only ones down there.
Who would fund them to go down there?
Well, that's their business. They want the whale. The commission wants the whale. They fund it.
Well, I would...
The revised management scheme that hasn't been implemented yet contemplates the funding of the scientific research and observers. It would require observers on the boats. That would have to be put in place. It's also set extremely precautionary. The revised management procedure, if it were adopted, and the catch limit algorithm would take about 1% of the Minkies annually. So it, again, as a preservationist, I agree with the gentleman here. I'd like no whales to be killed, right? But if whales are going to be killed, if the catch limit algorithm is adopted, it is so precautionary that even with high levels of scientific uncertainty, we can pretty much be assured that it's sustainable.
And then we're going to have to close.
Okay. I don't know where I should say. There are scientific research activities that Japan is cooperating from with the International Whaling Commission as a whole. And we are engaged in the research activities, non-lethal research activities, SOAR and POWER, and both North Pacific and Antarctic Ocean. So from that research activities, also similar outcomes are coming, and sometimes some level of sustainable whaling is really possible. And also, so we are not denying to be engaged in international research activities, and oftentimes that part is just ignored or not well understood in our public. And as to the number of minke whales, for example, the current agreed stock size in the Antarctic Ocean is, I think, around 500,000 animals. And that means if it's only 1%, 500 or more. Yeah, 5,000 animals. Yeah. And the number of animals subject to research is now, because of destruction and everything, a few hundred. So as long as sustainability is concerned, it's possible, and to utilize some of our abundant species, that's clear for everyone, for the scientists in IWC. But as I said, there are
fundamental position that not one way to be killed in either States, and that is very strongly promoted in that organization, and that is making this organization very dysfunctional. If it's only Japan and the United States, they are middle ground, and I'm sure that this organization works. But we have much more extreme, well, from their point of view, we are extreme. The other side, extreme countries like Australia, not one single place to be killed. And these days they are supported by many Latin American countries. So there are no middle ground in this organization. And that has been continuing for a long, long time. And this is a challenge that this organization is facing.
Okay. Well, we thank you.